Nitpicking, quibbling, or splitting hairs is one of the most common logical fallacies encountered in academia, but I find it's often poorly defined, or at least illustrated with bad examples. So I thought it would be interesting to do an episode about what nitpicking is and how to avoid it. The simplest definition I can think of is that nitpicking is imputing a flaw to an argument by reference to an error that is not a necessary part of that argument. Just to be clear, this is not the same as pedantry. Pedantry is not a fallacy, and while it's always annoying, it can be very useful. Spotting mistakes is useful, but you need to be careful about the implications. I once mistakenly wrote that Termez was in Afghanistan. It's not, it's in Uzbekistan. That was an error. But it wasn't an important error because my argument did not rest on where Termez is located. And in fact, it's relatively close to the border, so I didn't miss by very much, and I'm sure that's why neither I nor the editors spotted the problem. But it can be seductive to extrapolate from a mistake that there is something wrong with the argument as a whole. And like all fallacies, there is a sound heuristic underlying it. So I am going to give examples of both, when this would be a fallacy and when it wouldn't. Last year, I had to avoid the siren's call because I was very tempted in preparing an episode on R.S. Sharma's feudalism to talk about numismatics. Sharma was not good at numismatics. In fact, it'd be fair to say that Sharma was outright bad at numismatics and never really wrote anything about the subject without making mistakes. They drew false conclusions from the data, both in the sense that they were unwarranted by the evidence available, and also that we kind of suspect almost exactly the opposite was happening, but none of that matters. It really doesn't. Sharma's thesis that there were profound social and political changes in South Asia rests primarily on epigraphic evidence, particularly copper plate charters, not on numismatic evidence. Sharma came to the coins later, and yes, did mistakenly believe that they supported the argument, but the coins weren't why Sharma believed the argument was sound in the first place. And therefore, using the errors with the coins as a counter to the argument about the copper plate charters is the very essence of the nitpicking fallacy. It doesn't matter whether or not the argument from numismatic evidence is right or not, if the evidence from the epigraphy holds up. And no, I'm not suggesting here that you just ignore certain types of evidence. You can develop counter-arguments using different sorts of evidence, but you have to demonstrate not just that the argument you're countering is wrong, but that the evidence demonstrates the exact opposite. And we can't honestly, intellectually do that with the numismatic data, because the main point numismatists have made is that Sharma conflates money and coins and assumes that coins tell you something about money, which they don't really. Remember, not all money is coin. So I didn't talk about numismatics when I talked about feudalism, because fundamentally feudalism is an argument about copper plate charters and what their sudden appearance in the archaeological record tells us about social structures. And if you want to engage with that, you need to engage with the copper plate charters. Anything else is nitpicking. But as I said, fallacies are seductive because they are often good heuristics. So let's look at an example of where errors outside of the main argument are indicative of a serious problem. Wendy Doniger's book, The Hindus, contains this passage. And this is not good. Mathura is west of Varanasi. Varanasi wasn't part of the Kushan Empire, and those could just be clumsy wording, but the dates aren't. Doniger has confused the debate about when a particular king ruled with the dates of that king, and in turn confused those with the dates of the dynasty. The Kushan Empire existed from the late 1st century to the early 4th. It had 13 kings, of whom Kanishk was just the 4th, so definitely not the culmination. Most of his association with Buddhism seems to be mythical, and we have very little evidence that the Kushans were good cavalrymen, and they certainly weren't horse herders. Basically, there's a lot wrong with this passage. In fact, if you didn't already know everything that the passage is trying to communicate to you, then it would mislead you. But individually, None of this is any more than my Termes faux pas or Sharma's numismatic mistakes. It's just one paragraph, it's not central to the argument. The problem in the Hindus is that every single reviewer who looked at the work found similar issues in the sections they specialised in. The book is littered with errors, clumsy misreadings of dated general histories, and that is a problem. It suggests that the book was not well edited or properly checked, and that the author frequently strayed into areas they were just not sufficiently well read in. In its defence, the book does a lot of reading of literary works, and as a general rule, the issues that occur like this are in the contextualising sections. We ought to be sensitive to that. But this was a popular book, written for and marketed at readers, particularly in the United States, with no specialist knowledge and presumably limited understanding of Indian historiography. People who would have tended to read it as much for its broad sweep of history as its narrow discussion of particular passages, and who couldn't possibly be expected to know that the average Sanskritist doesn't actually care about the contextualizing information's accuracy, or be able to disentangle those parts Doniger is an expert in based on their other work with those parts where we really just ought to skip over the section. And in this case, it was also a hostage to fortune. Doniger is one amongst a number of textual scholars who are, let's say, unpopular with the religious right in India, what we sometimes call Hindutva. This book became the centre of a controversy, with the publishers having to sort of publicly semi-withdraw it from sale. And because the nuance of literary criticism was quite beyond the critics, the simple factual errors became an easy way for them to lambast it. It's tough to say how I feel about this. I like some of Doniger's work. I own other books she's written. Trying to get things banned is pretty reprehensible, and the people who manufactured the outrage weren't honest actors and are, by and large, fairly loathsome human beings. But on the other hand, the critique, while not an honest one, is basically true. The book is so riddled with errors that it's basically non-functional for its intended audience. But leaving the controversies aside, I think Doniger's book illustrates a case where mistakes, even mistakes that are not necessary parts of the main argument, do become an issue and can be a legitimate reason for dismissing a work. It is not a bad heuristic to assume that if a work is wrong on everything you can check, you probably shouldn't trust it on the things you can't. Of course, the point is that not all errors are equal, that dismissing a work either because of the seriousness of the errors or the pervasive nature or their centrality to the argument is sound, but that even when errors are egregious, as they were in my first example of Sharma's use of numismatics, they may not invalidate an argument or render it untenable, and distinguishing the two is hard. It's also very tempting when you don't want to accept the conclusions of something, or when you think it's genuinely wrong, to use nitpicking arguments to make your case sound more convincing. But then fallacies are fallacies precisely because they are difficult to avoid. They are logical errors which usually are only a few shades away from being good heuristics. And that is why nitpicking is such a tempting fallacy, and one we should always try to be aware of.